Okay, so I'm always on here complaining about fake YouTube polyglots and language influencers railroading people in conversations by just spamming phrases from the first few chapters of their textbooks at poor, unsuspecting native locals in order to shock them for clicks. And I stand by that. But I realized the other day that I never really told people what to do instead of that. And there's a real answer that's actually really interesting, and I guarantee it will dramatically improve your skills in your target language if you give it a shot. It will also make you a better conversationalist, make more people like you, and make you more attractive to the opposite sex. Or same sex if that's your jam. Sorry, Ace Gang, you're gonna have to fight them off. Is it a spy technique used by the CIA? Actually, yes. But they're not the only ones. Can anyone do it? Also, yes. And it's just going to make you more charismatic and likable and good at your target language. There's no negative side effects other than less free space on your social calendar. I'm Dr. Taylor Jones. I've got a PhD in linguistics from UPenn, and I make content about language, language learning, and linguistics. And I want to know what you're going to do with this new skill. This is Language Jones. Today's video is sponsored by Babbel. Babbel is one of the top language learning apps in the world, and it turns out, actually for good reason. Instead of an obscure path you have to follow lockstep regardless what your interests are, Babbel calibrates your learning to your interests. They have high-quality audio, they have pictures which definitely help you remember new words, and a variety of learning scenarios that keep things fresh and interesting. I started with A Day at the Beach in French, and I really liked how they taught impersonal constructions using the conditional like on se détendrait and on se baignerait.
Tu aurais 100 €?
Would you happen to have 100 euros? I'm gonna use that a lot.
Je serais bien contente.
And they also had little nuggets of cultural and linguistic knowledge that really helped. I already knew that I had learned nager to swim in school, but that my aunt and niece always used beignet when talking about someone going for a swim in the Mediterranean. Something was getting lost in translation. Thanks to Babbel, now I know why. Leave me a comment if you want to know the reason. Oh, and lest I forget, they also have an AI conversation partner if you want training wheels between the comfort of self-study and the skill building of talking to people. Let's do order at a cafe.
Bonjour, vous désirez?
Bon, quelque chose à boire.
Bien sûr. Que souhaitez-vous boire?
Hey, I just completed a task. Vous avez du vin?
Oui. Du vin rouge ou blanc?
Qu'est-ce que vous me recommandez comme vin? Babbel can help you start speaking in as little as 3 weeks and offers a 20-day money-back guarantee for users who decide it's not the right fit. They also have live classes and podcasts. It's a complete package. So if you're ready to get started on any of these 13 languages, click on my link or scan the QR code to get 60% off your Babbel subscription. What I'm about to lay out is honestly something I never did and regret not doing, but truthfully, I just put it together and I feel like an idiot for not doing it. So rather than keeping you in suspense, I'm going to tell you the 2 simple ideas to apply to learning your target language. Just let me say first that it's deceptively simple and that there's some nuance to implementing it, so stick around for that. The whole thing hinges on a combination of active listening and a variation of the sociolinguistic interview techniques I learned from Bill Labov. We have to adapt active listening to a cross-cultural context, and we might add a sprinkle of super spy social engineering, so stick around to the end to see how all of this fits together. I'm really kicking myself for not really working this into my learning sooner, but it's just not how language learning is taught. So the goal is to use the skills of good conversationalists, and make no mistake, they are skills, to guide your language study. Most language study is predicated around the basic idea that you don't know the words for things, or how to put sentences together. So they try to solve that problem by teaching you words and sentence structures. And if you're really lucky, they organize a course around various scenarios you might find yourself in. The idea is that there will be an exchange of information at the pharmacy or hotel check-in or cafe or whatever, and you'll need to be able to say, I'd like some aspirin or a hot towel or an espresso or whatever. Or if you're like me, all 3. Even if you learn more unstructured social conversations, the idea is that you have to demonstrate being able to say things, to tell people things, to understand questions. But understanding questions and then just monologuing is just a really, really shitty way to have a conversation. It's safe, and the hucksters on social media actually make it safer by basically putting guardrails on the conversation that move it relentlessly, inexorably back towards their comfort zone. Almost always motivation for language study and being able to say some nice things about whatever country and talk about learning languages. But it's effectively the opposite of active listening. Those influencers are listening for keywords they can latch onto and then drag their interlocutor back to the influencer's list of comfortable topics. So now I'm using active listening and question chaining, some people say conversation threading, to guide my language study. And it's a lot harder. but a lot more rewarding and effective. This is definitely for intermediate and advanced learners. You have to be able to mostly understand the responses you get, but it's a great way to improve your language skills, and more importantly, you have good conversations that leave the other person thinking, that was fun. He or she or they, Ace Gang, really gets me. What an interesting conversation. So, what is active listening? I'm glad I asked. Active listening is a constellation of techniques for creating a good conversationalist that focus on, well, listening actively. I mean, it's right there in the name. What that means in practice is not just waiting your turn to talk and then talking about yourself, and not assuming you know what someone is saying and having a conversation on autopilot, but actually really engaging with what the other person is saying as though it were the most interesting thing in the world. I've taught a version of this in some courses for foreign area officers and others, but it wasn't a course I developed, and I had some issues with cultural assumptions. For instance, direct eye contact. Eye contact can be a sign of openness, honesty, trustworthiness, and respect in some cultures, but it can also be a sign of disrespect and insubordination in others. So when you Google active listening, or worse, if you ask an AI, you'll get some answers with some baked-in cultural assumptions that we have to figure out. But I digress. The basic idea is to not interrupt, to validate what the other person is saying, to confirm that you understand, often by paraphrasing, and then to respond. And respond is where question chaining comes in. Now, sometimes it's taught in a form that tells you to plainly restate what the other person is saying. This can work in low context direct cultures, especially in things like arguments and relationships. That's because you're more likely than not to get, no, that's not what I meant. And then you can ask for clarification and come to a better understanding of the underlying issues at hand. But it's also not universal, and in scenarios like high-stakes diplomatic negotiations, there's very often instances where a direct on-record statement of what you understand someone to be saying will be an absolute unmitigated disaster. So take it with a grain of salt. Sometimes you just have to confirm, back channel, indirectly that you're picking up what they're putting down, so to speak. This is particularly important in cultures that instantiate their social norms around politeness through indirectness. That could include Japanese, Persian, and French norms, but if we're being honest, if you're American watching this, basically everybody is less direct, with the exception of Eastern Europeans, Israelis, and the Dutch. What I recommend instead of a blunt restatement, especially in a casual conversation, is one of two things. Either a statement of how something must be, or a question about how that made the speaker feel. The first one is basically, oh, that must have been challenging, or fun, or exciting, or whatever. The second is just pretend you're Freud. And how does that make you feel? Did that make you think of your father? Ironically, another key component is just setting aside how you feel and validating how the other person feels. That's not to say you can't have your feelings about a topic, and in small talk, expressing how you would feel in someone else's shoes when they're telling a story can be very validating and a sign of empathy. That's why that last approach works. But I think just generally, shifting the focus to questioning and listening is the key takeaway for the first part. This has two huge ramifications. First, it just immediately entails that you can listen and comprehend. This is hard to fake, and if you watch the YouTube fake polyglots closely, you'll see it's where they really fall down. But second, you have to be able to ask questions, and that's where question chaining comes in. Let's say you're talking with someone you just met at a party or something. One easy in is to compliment them on something they're wearing or holding or whatever it is. But it's not enough to say, that's a beautiful watch, because they say thanks and then you stare at each other awkwardly until YouTube polyglot mode kicks in and you just start rambling at them about how you love to learn languages, because languages are interesting. So instead, that's a beautiful watch, and then literally any question, preferably a question that cannot be answered with a yes or no. So is it new is not as good as, where does one get a watch like that? I recently saw a clip of Andrew Bustamante demonstrating a CIA variation of this on Mayim Bialik. He asked two questions and made a validating statement. I'm not saying you need to be rigidly like that, but the general principle is sound. So that's a beautiful watch. I've always wanted a nice timepiece, but never knew how to get into that. Where does one get a watch like that? Is better. What do you like most about it? Does it have any drawbacks? Now, there's a few steps to this process, and they're really important. If you don't follow them, you will sound like a robot interrogating them about a boring topic, and they'll hate you because you're painfully boring and somehow obsessed with them. First is brainstorm questions, like 5 to 10 of them about whatever it is. You should be able to do this really fast. It takes practice. Second, and this is crucial, do not expect to ask all of those questions. I'm getting bored of the watch, so let's just say they're holding a book. So let's do 5 questions. How do you like it so far? What's it about? Have you read anything else by this author? What made you choose this book? What else are you reading? Now, each of these will generate some answer, at which point you forget these and generate new questions. So for instance, you ask, how is it? And they say, I'm not that far in. You don't then follow up with, what's it about? Or what else has the author written? You pivot to, are you enjoying the writing style so far? Or, oh, so what about it caught your eye? If they say, it's not mine and I'm holding it for a friend, then you just go right into more questions. Let's take a moment here and think about what this means for language learning. Just something as simple as the watch or the book example. Can you easily generate 3 to 5 questions in your target language about either of those scenarios? Do you have the vocabulary to do perspective taking and evaluate with emotion words? If you're really confident, leave me a comment with what 3 to 5 questions you'd ask then. Now, I give objects as talking points, but I live in New York, so I very often hear people talking in other languages, and they're usually, but not always, tourists. So I have a very easy in by asking, in their language, where they're from. And that leads naturally to follow-ups, like either stating something you know about that place, or asking about it, even as simple as, what's that like? But what if you get a negative answer? Like, emotionally negative. Let's pursue this. If the thing you know about their place is the stereotype everybody knows, you can gauge that reaction, comment that that's probably the thing everybody knows, and ask them what they wish people knew about where they're from. But don't. Deeper connection right off the bat. If they're like, I live here, you can ask what made them choose to, how they like it, and for deeper rapport building, something like, do you find that it's difficult to maintain your traditions or culture here? Is there anything you really miss from home? What do you like most about here? Dislike most about here? Again, don't just spam them with questions, but these are all options. Third, relate to their responses. If you want to be a super spy, use that to seg to another question. If you want to be a regular person, you can relate by, of course, saying more about yourself as well and your preferences. But notice, this is going to be something like, I never really read any of author X. My favorite author is actually probably Thomas Pynchon or Vladimir Nabokov. You can, of course, then go right back to questions if you want. Have you ever read Pnin? It's a lesser known one of his, but it's hilarious. The Super Spy social engineering game is a great way to practice the most extreme version of this if you're the kind of person that this appeals to. That's where you go to a cafe or whatever and intentionally chat somebody up, but you secretly have 2 goals. First, to have the other person enjoy the conversation, and second, to extract as much information as possible while giving little or no information about yourself in return. The unhinged version is to come up with a completely false story about yourself. This is absolutely social engineering, but if you're working hard in developing social skills and you literally change your behavior and it's more effective, are we engineering the other person or are we engineering ourselves? Perhaps the real social engineering is all the friends we made along the way. I think what's really crazy about this is that it's just a good practice in any language for being a good conversationalist. Now, of course, there are times you should not do this. If you're in a dangerous place where you don't know the customs, if it's an inappropriate time for casual conversation, just shut your mouth and open your eyes and ears and be safe, dummy. And as a New Yorker, I'm always attuned to scams, so when some people are a little too eager to talk, especially when it's not quite an appropriate situation, I am immediately highly suspicious. But at social gatherings, cafes, bus stops, this is gold. Notice that we've completely flipped language learning on its head. Traditional methods usually have built in that they're trying to provide you with words and grammatical structures to learn, and then evaluating whether you have learned, can understand, and can produce them. So we train ourselves to be asked questions and then to answer them. And the polyglot parlor trick so many YouTubers do is just spamming people with basic statements that you should have learned early on. And then when they get any compliment, just talking about language learning. This still allows you to control the conversation rather than be constantly on the back foot as you're reacting to who knows what in your target language. But you actually have a conversation that the other person enjoys because there's not much people like more than talking about themselves. So instead of railroading people with generic platitudes about language learning, we have to develop the skills to ask a wide variety of questions. We have to be able to generate questions based on a topic or theme, and then we also have to understand the responses and be able to make evaluative statements about them, at least in theory. There's a huge risk here though. What happens when you don't understand the response? This is why I said you should be at an intermediate level before focusing on this, but really all this means is that you need a decent but not overly extensive vocabulary. You can probably guess what I'm going to say here, but when you don't understand something, ask a clarifying question. I'm not familiar with that. Is that a place? Honestly, even if you're not yet ready for all the rest of this, a huge skill to develop right now is to ask clarifying questions about what precisely you didn't understand. So instead of, I don't understand, you can say, I'm afraid I don't understand. Can you clarify for me what X is? And then you're both having a conversation and learning more of your target language. And the interlocutor feels helpful and knowledgeable. Of course, there are caveats here too. Don't ask about every single pastry at a crowded boulangerie during the weekday rush. Non, je comprends pas. Qu'est-ce que c'est qu'une baguette? Is not gonna fly. But even there, something like, que sont les spécialités ici? Qu'est-ce que vous me pourriez recommander? Probably will. When you do this approach, you have better conversations and you get better at your target language faster. But you also have new experiences you otherwise wouldn't, and you learn about people and all sorts of things in the world you otherwise wouldn't learn about. And then, when you draw on that in your next conversations, at some point, you're the most interesting man in the world. So let me know. Do you already do this? It's pretty rare, so a better question is, how do you plan to try this out? It can be hard in a classroom setting. One way I do it with apps like Babbel or The Bird or textbooks or whatever is to take whatever they're teaching and just try to play this game. Come up with a question for each sentence you see. If you like what I'm doing with the channel, please like and subscribe, and of course, leave a comment or a question. It's great for the algorithm. You can support the channel right here with super thanks or on Patreon at patreon.com/languagejones. Until next time, happy learning.